I want to start this video off on a positive note, which might be tough to do this week with all the injuries and buys that we're facing. But at the tight end position, I don't know if you really need to worry all that much this week. Yeah, we don't want to be missing Trey McBride. That one's going to hurt. But Sam Laporta, he's been up and down all season. He had a couple of tight end 4 weeks back to back, but last week, he didn't really do anything. Other than that, Brock Bowers, he's been injured for a while. Las Vegas is on the bye. LA on the bye, not using Tyler Higbee. I don't know how many of you out there actually have ever had him in your lineup recently. Seattle Seahawks, AJ Barner was a guy that we were kind of going back and forth on. He's had some good games, he hasn't, but you can probably find somebody else to play for him this week. And then for Jacksonville, Brenton Strange has been missing anyway. So what matchups are going to have some options that we can dive into this week if you do need help at the tight end position? Let's start with Thursday Night Football. And TJ Hawkinson, I'm completely out on this week. If he couldn't get it done at the beginning of the season without Jordan Addison, like I said at the beginning of the year, he wasn't going to get it done after Jordan Addison came back. And those are the guys, Addison and Jefferson, that are getting the looks. And in this matchup, I expect them to try and run the football quite a bit as well, especially with how Carson Wentz played last week. For TJ Hawkinson, he hasn't been fantasy relevant in 5 of 6 games this year. On the other sideline, let's discuss Oronde Gadsden, because a lot of people are going to look at his performance last week and just be on the train right away. And he's had some good performances this season outside of that. So it's not that I'm worried about him as just a consistent playmaker. It's I'm worried about the people around him, because now all 3 wide receivers are healthy. Keenan Allen, Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston. And you might be saying, well, Kyle, they were all healthy last week, so why wouldn't he be a start this week if it's that big of a concern? Well, they were in negative game script basically the entire game last week. And I don't know if you're going to find that with Minnesota. He does have 18 targets over his last couple of games, so we'll continue to monitor it. But if you're looking for somebody to use this week, Gadsden is not the worst case scenario, and he's definitely a guy that has some top 12 upside. But reaching that upside would mean that this game does not go the way the LA Chargers want it to. Miami and Atlanta, and Darren Waller is going to be week to week for now with a pec injury, and there's no telling when exactly he will return. But the one thing that I do know is that Miami didn't even pay attention to their tight ends prior to Darren Waller returning this season. So why they would start paying attention to them after Darren Waller, I'm not 100% sure. Yep, there's no Tyreek Hill now. Yep, there's no Darren Waller now. You're still going to have to throw it to Jalen Waddle. Maybe Malik Washington starts seeing some more targets, but with the way Tua and this offense have played, I'd rather just play it safe. Another week of trying to figure out whether or not Kyle Pitts is actually a decent option for us. And when you take a look at the numbers, it feel like it may be, because Miami over the last 4 weeks are allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game. And then when you take a look at what Kyle Pitts did last week, a season high in targets with 10, the second time this year he's gone over 60 receiving yards, it makes you feel like, oh, well, maybe Kyle Pitts has a solid matchup here. But it's kind of been the floors for tight ends against Miami as of recent, because in the last couple of weeks, the matchups that they've had, Oronde Gadsden, he had 7 catches and 68 yards. Okay, not great by any means, solid floor. Same thing for Mason Taylor, 65 yards on 5 receptions. Solid floor going up against Miami. Then with Carolina playing against them, you throw in a touchdown for their tight ends, and it pushes that fantasy points per game up to make it look a little higher than what it is. So for Kyle Pitts this week, I believe it's really his floor that we would rather see, because I don't know if the ceiling is actually there. For the Jets and the Bengals, Mason Taylor should be a smash start this week. We shouldn't even be thinking about it unless you have one of like the top tight end options. But how are we able to trust him if his own team doesn't even seem to trust him that much right now? And maybe it's not that they don't trust him. Maybe it's poor game planning. Maybe it's poor play calling. Maybe it's Justin Fields. And now it sounds like they're moving to Tyrod Taylor. So potentially it could change a little bit. But this is a really good matchup for Mason Taylor. And he absolutely could take advantage of it with a really high ceiling. Last week, this Bengals defense gave up 5 receptions on 6 targets for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns to Pat Freiermuth. Another 3 receptions for 28 yards and a touchdown to Jonnu Smith. And another 2 yards on 3 receptions and 1 touchdown to Darnell Washington. But not just that, recent performances against this team as well. Sam Laporta had 92 yards and a touchdown. Tucker Kraft had 43 yards and a touchdown. You have to. You've got to try and play Mason Taylor. If you've got like a top 1, 2, or 3 option, then probably not. But Mason Taylor has to have one of the highest upsides of any tight end this week. Noah Fant is an interesting fringe option this week going up against the New York Jets. Now, Fant was 4-4, 44, and 1 last week. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 44 yards, and 1 touchdown, which it makes me want to move him to a fringe start. And I decided to end up doing that. But there's a couple of concerns that I have. And number one would be I see a positive game script for Cincinnati, potentially meaning that they're going to throw it a little bit less. They've had to go back and forth with teams this season. And depending on how the New York Jets offense plays, Cincinnati may not need to throw it nearly as much as we've seen as of late. But also, Andrei Iosivas is a guy that is seeing a decent amount of targets too. He saw 4 last week, just like Noah Fant. And I think he's a guy that could switch in and out as that number 3 option. Mike Gesicki being on the IR really helps out Noah Fant, though, and Fant could be a guy that over the next couple of weeks could be a fringe starting option for us. Harold Fannin Jr. had an awesome opportunity last week, and maybe it was because of the weather, maybe it's just because the Browns suck. I'm not 100% sure. He couldn't take advantage of it, but I am going to list him as a start once again this week. Going up against the New England Patriots, currently allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks to opposing tight ends. Now, Chigioco did absolutely nothing against them, and Juwan Johnson had an okay day at best, but it was the 2 games before that where Dalton Kincaid had 6 catches on 6 targets for 108 yards and plays a similar role as Fannin, where he does go to the slot every once in a while. And then before that, going up against Carolina, their tight end scored 2 touchdowns against this defense as well. I'm sorry, but I can't do it with Hunter Henry this week. I can't. Not going up against Cleveland, currently allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks to opposing tight ends. But since being the tight end 1 and the tight end 8 in back-to-back weeks, Henry has been the tight end 26, 33, and 23. There's really no justification for playing him at this current point in time. Is he going to have some big games every once in a while? Absolutely. And even though the fantasy points per game might look a little bit lower because Waller took a 0 against them before being hurt last week, Hunter Henry, to me, is still way too inconsistent at this point. And even with the buys, I feel like we have better options right now. Both Theo Johnson and Daniel Bellinger had solid weeks last week for the New York Giants, and now they're going to get a rematch from a couple of weeks ago with the Philadelphia Eagles. And over the last 4 weeks, the Eagles are allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And last week was a big week for both of these guys. Bellinger had 88 yards on 3 receptions and a touchdown. Johnson had 66 yards on 3 receptions and a touchdown. Now, Daniel Bellinger is going to be a sit for me. Theo Johnson will be a fringe start. And the reason I will lean Johnson over Bellinger, even though Bellinger had more yards, is because A, Johnson still had more targets, 7 compared to 4, and the snap percentages. Bellinger played 68% of the snaps. Johnson played 88% of the snaps. Now, the Eagles faced TJ Hawkinson last week, and he probably should have had a touchdown, could have had a touchdown, woulda, shoulda, could have. He thought it was a catch. Ref said it wasn't. Whatever. Touchdown called back. They faced Evan Ingram as well. They faced Cade Otton as of recent, and Evan Ingram did have a touchdown, but other than that, there hasn't been a whole lot of production from tight ends against this defense. Now, on paper, the New York Giants allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and over the last 4 weeks, they've faced the Broncos, the Eagles, the Saints, the Chargers, a couple decent tight ends, some guys that they've kept in check. That's great. But the one guy that we need to mention is this guy, Dallas Goedert. A couple of weeks ago, he was the tight end 1 after catching 9 of his 11 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown. We will list Dallas Goedert as a start again. Dalton Kincaid gets a solid matchup with Carolina. Over the last 4 weeks, they're allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game. Now, Carolina did shut down Mason Taylor last week, but recently against them, Hunter Henry had 2 receptions for 39 yards and a touchdown. Darren Waller had 78 yards on 5 receptions and a touchdown, and Jake Ferguson, he had a touchdown too. 33 yards on 3 receptions and a touchdown. Kincaid has been a tight end 1 in 4 of 5 games this season. Dalton Kincaid is a start again. Overall, this will be a tougher matchup for the tight ends in Carolina, and there hasn't really been a whole lot of separation there. Ja'Tavion Sanders, Mitchell Evans, Tommy Tremble, they're all seeing some time. They're all seeing some targets. Not one guy is the guy. Chicago and Baltimore, for me, is the matchup of what could be at the tight end position. With Colston Loveland, he was drafted as a top 10 pick, but hasn't been utilized this year. Mark Andrews, if they consistently fed him more targets, how more consistent would he be? What would be his ceiling and what would be his floor? And even though these two teams can't be consistent with their tight ends, I think you should be though, and you can ask our partners over at Tushy to help you out with that. Tushy has a ton of great products, and when they came to us, they said there's nobody better to promote our product than the tight end whisperer himself, because nobody loves tight ends more than Kyle than us here at Tushy. And if you go check out all of their great products and find something that you're interested in, use code Headliners at checkout. Headliners is gonna get you 10% off of your order. And like I said, if you love your tight end as much as I love tight ends, then Tushy is definitely the way to go. I don't know if we'll ever know whether or not George Kittle was just supposed to be a decoy last week, or if he really was 100% healthy and could have balled out. He told reporters after the game that he thought he could have. He said he thought he was going to go for a couple of touchdowns and even apologized to fantasy managers. I love George Kittle. Dude is awesome. Would love to have him on the show sometime. Going up against Houston, though. Not the matchup that I want after such a poor performance last week. Right now, Houston allowing the third fewest fantasy points per game. And I'm just going to be cautious again with him because maybe he isn't 100% and maybe they're just playing it off like he is. With Juwan Jennings healthy, well, I say healthy loosely for Juwan Jennings. Ricky Pearsall supposed to be back. Kendrick Bourne has played well in a couple of games since everybody's been injured. And of course, Christian McCaffrey, a ton of targets as well. If you have to start George Kittle, I absolutely get it. George Kittle is going to probably be a top 12 option for a majority of people. He's probably going to be top 12 in our rankings, and if not, very close to it. So for George Kittle this week, it's a tougher matchup. People are starting to get healthy again. Is he 100%? Just a lot of question marks. So for me, he's a fringe start because I just want everyone to not really be relying on his upside. But Dalton Schultz could be a really solid option for those of you that need to take a shot on somebody. Coming into last week's game, he had 6 targets in 3 straight games. And then last week, that bumped up to 10. And it sounds like Nico Collins could really be in consideration for missing next week after dealing with a concussion. So we'll keep an eye on Nico Collins, but Dalton Schultz, he definitely might not have a high ceiling, but he certainly could have a decent floor. I'm going to leave Cade Otton as a fringe start right now for the Tampa Bay and New Orleans matchup. This past week, he had 9 targets on Monday Night Football. With even those 9 targets, he was only tight end 14. Scoring this year is up at the tight end position, and because of that, some of those performances, like what Otton had last week, just aren't cutting it because tight ends are scoring more this season. And we know Mike Evans is going to miss time. Emeka Egbuka, we're going to assume is fully healthy. He looked decent last week. Maybe not nearly as much speed as what he's had at the beginning of the season, but I would expect if he played on Monday night, he's going to be fully healthy this week. Will Chris Godwin be back? And even if he isn't, Tez Johnson has stepped up as another option. And of course, potential targets to Rachaad White. So for me, I know a lot of people keep coming back to Cade Otton, and sometimes it makes sense. But he continues to just be one of those guys that's utilized sometimes and completely forgotten about others. Now, Tampa Bay is allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends over the last 4 weeks. And Juwan Johnson finally showed a little bit of life again last week. I mean, he disappeared for 5 weeks after having a hot start to the season. He looked like a legitimate top 12 tight end. And then he just kind of faded away, and he was back to tight end 12 last week. I just can't automatically jump back on board with him being a start. I do think Taysom Hill could be on the field a little bit more often, but I think that could be in the backfield moving forward. He's got some touchdown potential, but still at this point, not enough to warrant a start. Denver may be allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks to tight ends, but I don't care. It's Jake Mother and Ferguson, people. Lots of concerns. When CeeDee Lamb comes back, what are his targets going to look like? Well, CeeDee Lamb was back, and he still had 7 targets last week. He's been a top 12 tight end in all but 1 game this season, and he has 6 touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. I will say this, Evan Engram is way closer to being a sit than he is an actual must start for me. And he's right in the middle because I can see the opportunity. at least 6 targets in each game since he came back from his injury, but he only has one top 12 performance. Are they trying to get him there? They are. Are they actually getting it there? No, because the production isn't coming along with all the targets. But because of the targets, he still needs to be under consideration, especially if you're desperate in maybe a bigger league. Over the last 4 weeks, Indianapolis has allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but Chigiooko, he had a solid opportunity last week and they still didn't do anything with it. I don't really think it makes a whole lot of sense to start anybody in this Tennessee offense right now. They've only scored 6 touchdowns on offense this year. The Lions have a game where they scored 7 touchdowns. Tyler Warren's matchup doesn't look nearly as good, Tennessee allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to tight ends over the last 4 weeks, but you can't argue with the production and the floor. And even in the tougher matchups, Tyler Warren is becoming one of those guys that you start no matter what. He's been a top 12 tight end in all but 1 game this season, and he has at least 60 receiving yards in all but 2. Tucker Kraft may have the most upside of any tight end this week, going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who currently allow the most fantasy points per game to the opposing tight end position. It's a solid matchup. This is exactly where Tucker Kraft should, and I say should, excel. With it being a great matchup, Tucker Kraft could be a top 2, top 3 tight end this week. And I really hope that he does get there, but sometimes he tends to disappear, and hopefully it's not this week. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with the tight ends in Pittsburgh because they have 4 tight ends that are playing on a regular basis right now. 4 tight ends getting over 30% of the snaps. I mean, I had them all as sits last week, and we see how that worked out. It's not going to happen every single week, but moving forward in really good matchups like this, going up against Green Bay, currently allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to the tight end position. Muth last week, 111 receiving yards. Smith with 28. Washington with 2. Each one of them had at least 1 touchdown. Now, Washington will be the odd man out for me. For whatever reason, he was over 80% of the snaps the 2 weeks coming into this past week. This week, dropped back down to 63. Jonnu Smith led the way. He was at 70. Pat Freiermuth was at 65. So they're even rotating at certain points. And maybe if they're running the ball a little bit more, then Darnell Washington will be out there a little bit more. Maybe if they're passing it more, it would be Muth and Smith. It's the best finish by Pat Freiermuth this season, and he was the tight end 25 before this last week. The Zach Ertz start designation could change very quickly. Why? It's all about Jayden Daniels. With this game being on Monday Night Football, we may not hear about Jayden Daniels until a little bit later in the week. And because of that, we may not know exactly whether or not Zach Ertz is a good option. Now, the reason he's a start right now is you almost have to. Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel, they also missed last week. So it could be later in the week before we know about those guys as well. But the last time Marcus Mariota started for the Commanders, Zach Ertz wasn't even looked at. So this is risky at best if Mariota is the starter. It gets a little bit less risky if the wide receivers are out, but that's a lot to bank on as the week goes on. Travis Kelce, he's been solid for a majority of the season, but there are still concerns on my end about who is going to be the guy every single week. Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, Marquise Brown, Tyquan Thornton, Juju Smith-Schuster, Travis Kelce, I don't know, did I say his name first? Brashad Smith, who saw a decent amount of targets last week, and maybe that was just because of the score of the game, but Kelce, he's going to be a guy that is going to be way riskier moving forward now. Headliner Nation, 6 teams on a bye this week, so hopefully the information I helped you out with in this video is enough to help you set your lineups for the tight end position. Maybe start making a couple of moves on the waiver wire and positioning yourself to be successful with a big dub this week in fantasy football. Make sure you hit the like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, bell notification, comment down below, whatever it is, interact with the video in some way, shape, or form, and it's greatly appreciated. But stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.